In 1954, this palace was sold for $35, not $35,000. 35. The price of an old armchair, the cost of demolition. It was built by a man whose patriot neighbors considered him a traitor. Every stone here was paid for with money stolen from the British Crown. And today, it looks directly at West Point, the citadel of American patriotism. And now you will learn how this symbol of betrayal, sentenced to death, managed to cheat history itself. We will reveal why its creator, who built a house to buy himself a reputation, ended up losing absolutely everything, except for the building itself. There are places that seem perfect, sun-drenched lawns where history doesn't weigh you down, but only delicately reminds you of itself with the whisper of the wind in old trees. Boscobel is one of them. Its facade, measured with mathematical precision, its columns, slender and proud, speak the language of the young American Republic, the language of order, reason, and limitless possibilities. From here, on the high bank of the Hudson River, a view opens up that is, in itself, a national treasure. Below, the majestic river. And there, on the opposite bank, stands the West Point Military Academy, like a stern guard, the citadel of American duty and honor. It seems this house is the embodiment of the American dream, a monument to success built by one of the founding fathers, a symbol of the values for which patriots fought and died. Every detail here speaks not so much of taste as of an ideal, but this harmony is merely a meticulously constructed facade, and if you look closely, it begins to crack at the seams, because beneath this splendor hides a story not of creation, but of survival, not of patriotism, but of betrayal. Let's travel to the 1950s. Here it is, the very same house. But it's not an elegant estate, but a ghost awaiting its executioner, a skeleton of its former glory. Its perfect symmetry is broken by shattered windows. Its proud columns have peeled, exposing the plain wood beneath. The house that was designed to declare status now stands silent, abandoned, and needed by no one. It stands in the path of a new highway. Its fate is sealed. And here is the document, the deed, the final page in the history of this architectural masterpiece. The sum of the deal, written in dry clerical script, seems like a mockery, an insult. $35, not $35,000. 35. The price of an old armchair, the cost of demolition. And this is where the main question arises. How did this house, built on capital siphoned from the British Crown's treasury during the War of Independence, how did this palace, erected by a man whom his patriot neighbors considered an enemy collaborator, how did it end up one step away from being turned into a pile of rubble, only to be sold for the price of a meal at a roadside diner? And the main paradox, how, after surviving its own death sentence, was it reborn to become an icon of American heritage? To ironically, day after day, gaze upon the main bastion of the very patriotism its creator once opposed. This house is not just a building. It is a stone argument in a dispute with fate. Its first owner built it to buy himself a reputation and a place in history. He could not have guessed that history would cheat him, taking everything from him, except for the house itself. And it is in this stone, sold for a pittance, that the true story of America is hidden, a story of how the most questionable ambitions can give birth to the most enduring beauty. We are used to thinking of the American Revolution as a saga written in blood and courage on the fields of Lexington and Yorktown, but that is only the public face of history. Behind the scenes, far from the cannonades, another war was being fought. A war without uniforms or flags, a war of numbers, contracts, and ledgers, and the greatest fortunes of that era were made not on the battlefields, but in the silence of offices, where a stroke of the pen could bring more gold than any military victory. At the very center of this financial storm was a young man named States Morris Dyckman, not a soldier, not a hero, a clerk. He held a modest position in the quartermaster department of the British Army, under the command of Sir William Erskine. On paper, his task was simple: to supply His Majesty's army with everything it needed: provisions, fodder, transport. In reality, he managed the financial artery of the entire British war machine in America. A river of gold, meant for waging war, flowed through his hands, and he quickly realized that he could draw from this river. The scheme was brilliant in its simplicity and cynicism. Two currencies circulated in the colonies. Two worlds existed. The first was the world of hard currency: British pounds sterling, Spanish doubloons, gold, and silver. This was the currency of reality. The second world was the world of continental dollars, paper money printed by the young Revolutionary Congress. Their value fell with each passing day, with every defeat of Washington's army. It was a paper ghost, a currency of hope that was rapidly turning to dust. Dyckman and his superiors' scam was to live on the border of these two worlds. They paid suppliers with hard, clinking gold, receiving real goods and services. But in the reports sent to London, they listed expenses in depreciating continental dollars, using the most favorable exchange rate for themselves. The difference, a colossal, astronomical difference, settled in their own pockets. Every stone for the future Boscobel was paid for with this alchemy, an alchemy that turned British taxpayers' money into a personal fortune. And here lies the most cynical twist of this story. States Morris Dyckman was not just a British employee. His own maternal grandfather, Lewis Morris, was one of those who signed the Declaration of Independence. While his grandfather pledged his life, fortune, and sacred honor to the cause of freedom, his grandson was systematically robbing the army sent to destroy that freedom. He was a loyalist, not by conviction, but by calculation. He bet on the victory of the British Empire because that bet paid him dividends every day. This wealth didn't smell of lavender and the wax of old studies. It smelled of gunpowder, horse sweat, and betrayal. Every pound sterling misappropriated by Dyckman was a ration that never reached a soldier, medicine that was never bought for a field hospital. It was another nail in the coffin of the cause for which his countrymen, and possibly his distant relatives, were fighting. But the war ended, and Britain lost. Suddenly, Dyckman found himself a winner on the losing side. He was fabulously wealthy, but his wealth was toxic. He was a loyalist in a new republic of patriots. And what was worse, his former masters in London, counting their losses, began asking very uncomfortable questions about their irregular accounts. He got the money, but now he had to fight desperately to keep it. After 13 years in the London fog, in a labyrinth of courts and accounts, States Morris Dyckman finally returns home. But what is home for a man who bet on the wrong side in the war for his own nation's birth? He had defended his money. Every pound, every shilling torn from the clutches of the British Treasury was now his. But money, like people, has a memory, and his capital remembered the roar of British cannons and the clink of gold used to pay mercenaries. In the new America, he was a ghost from the past. To the war heroes, his future neighbors, whose lands were soaked in blood, he was not just a rich man. He was a man whose fortune had grown on their suffering. How could he make them forget? How to wash the gold of the scent of treason? In a society built on honor, wealth alone was not enough. Something more was needed. A symbol was needed. Dyckman's answer was not in words. It was in stone and wood. He decided to build not just a dwelling. He decided to build an alibi, a manifesto of brick that would speak for him when all others were silent, a building that was meant to shout down his past. And for this, he chose the most powerful language that existed in America at the time, the federal style. This was not just a fashion, it was an architectural flag. Symmetry, harmony, light, all of it was a declaration of commitment to the ideals of the Enlightenment, the ideals of the new republic. He built his house according to the same principles by which Jefferson and Madison built the nation. It was an act of architectural mimicry, an attempt to don the uniform of a victor. He went further. He literally built eagles, the primary symbol of the United States, into his home's DNA. Every eagle carved from wood above a mantelpiece, every plaster bird soaring beneath the ceiling, was a desperate oath of allegiance. This plasterwork was paid for with money that should have gone toward muskets for British soldiers. Now, it was paying for patriotic iconography. It was, perhaps, the most expensive attempt at assimilation in history. But in the very soul of this American inform house, Dyckman hid a poison. Its name. Boscobel. To the uninitiated, just a beautiful word. But for a man of his circle, it was a code word, a direct reference to the royal oak and the house in England where the deposed King Charles II hid from his Republican enemies. The house's facade screamed, "Long live the Republic." But its name whispered, "God save the King." This building was a machine for rewriting a biography. It was supposed to take the questionable capital of a Loyalist profiteer and transform it into the respectable legacy of an American gentleman, to turn new, dirty money into old, respectable money. He designed his perfect fortress to protect his reputation from a hostile world. But he overlooked one thing. The greatest threat to his grand design would come not from the outside, but from within. The year is 1804. On the banks of the Hudson, the first stone is laid. The construction of a dream begins. But a strange silence hangs over the building site. There are workers, there are materials, there are blueprints. But the most important thing is missing: the architect. The man whose vision is being transformed into reality isn't there to direct, to correct, to inspire. He is a ghost. His name is State's Morris Dyckman, and he is 3,000 miles away, in London, in the very heart of the empire he once so diligently plundered. He has not yet finished his financial war, but he has already begun an architectural one. And his weapons are not a trowel and a plumb line. His weapons are a quill pen and floods of ink. From his London apartment, ships sail across the Atlantic, laden not only with goods, but with orders. Dozens of letters, covered in a tight, neat script. This is the true foundation of Boscobel. Dyckman is an architect demiurge, creating his world from a distance. He is obsessed. Every detail, from the shape of a window sash to the alloy from which the doorknobs must be cast, is born in his imagination and immediately put to paper. He orders wallpaper with the latest fashion, Pompeian motifs. He selects fabrics he has seen in the homes of British aristocrats. He copies elements from the catalogues of Robert Adam, the genius of neoclassicism, and sends these sketches to America as an immutable law. Every swirl on the wallpaper ordered in London is another coin won back from the British Treasury. Money acquired through deceit is now spent in the pursuit of impeccable taste. And on the other side of the world, in the dust and noise of the construction site, a carpenter named William Yeomans tries to bring these ghostly instructions to life. He is not an architect. He is a medium, a man who must translate the language of London salons into the language of simple American oak and pine. He unfolds another sheet, yellowed by sea salt, and tries to understand what exactly this invisible client demands. How to turn a vague drawing from an expensive English book into a real, sturdy structure? This isn't construction. It is a battle. The battle of one man's ambitions against the reality of transatlantic communication in the early 19th century. The ocean is not just a distance, it is a chasm of time. A question asked in New York in May would receive an answer in August, at best. Any mistake made by the carpenter became unfixable for months. The house grew slowly, painfully, like a child of two parents who had never met. Boscobel was meant to proclaim harmony and order, but it was born in chaos and uncertainty. Its walls were raised to the sound of hammers, but its soul was shaped by the distant scratching of a pen. Dyckman, the phantom architect, was winning his war with space. He was building his house from across an ocean, but he did not know he was fighting another, far more terrible battle. A battle not with distance, but with time, measured not in nautical knots, but in the beats of his own fading heart. As Boscobel slowly rose above the Hudson, floor by floor, it did not grow in a vacuum. It intruded upon another world, a world where the ground still remembered the tramp of soldiers' boots, and the people remembered who was on which side. This was a land of heroes. Very nearby was the estate of General Philip Van Cortlandt, a man whose name was synonymous with patriotism. His neighbors were farmers who had dropped their plows to take up muskets and fight for independence. And here, amid these fields, among these people whose honor had been forged in the crucible of battle, a palace arises. It is not being built by a war hero. It is being built by a man who spent that war counting British gold. Every window fitted into its frame, every column raised onto the porch, was not just an architectural detail. It was a defiance. For the local residents, Boscobel was not an object of admiration. It was a monument to injustice. When they looked at its elegant facade, they did not see beauty. They saw money earned from their hardships. Every stone in that wall was paid for with gold that should have gone toward weapons aimed against them. This house was a daily, silent reminder that while some sacrificed everything, others profited from everything. In the local archives, in the yellowed pages of diaries and letters from that era, we find no enthusiastic reviews. We find a deafening silence, more eloquent than any words. It is the silence of suspicion, of envy, and of unspoken contempt. Boscobel was an island of foreign wealth in a sea of collective memory of the war. It was surrounded not by lawns, but by hostility. States Dyckman wasn't just building a house, he was building a fortress meant to protect him not from natives or bandits, but from the gazes of his neighbors. Its tall windows, overlooking the river, were like embrasures looking out on a world that did not accept him. Its thick walls were meant to muffle the whispers behind his back. He wanted to create a perfect world inside, because he knew the world outside would never be his. He surrounded himself with English furniture, French wallpaper, Chinese porcelain, objects from the distant, larger world, because the world just a few miles from his doorstep was alien and hostile to him. Boscobel was his personal Versailles, built in exile. Not a geographical one, but a social one. He constructed his defense out of brick and elegance, hoping that beauty could disarm memory. He believed that if his house were perfect enough, people would eventually forget what money had built it. But he failed to consider that the memories of farmers and veterans have a very long life. And while he erected his fortress against external enemies, he was losing the war against a far more formidable adversary, one that had already entrenched itself within his own walls. In Dyckman's mind, his house was already built. He saw it in the smallest detail: the gleam of polished brass, the shimmer of silk on the windows, the finest pattern on a porcelain cup. But between this perfect picture in London and the real construction site in New York lay the Atlantic. And this ocean was not just a body of water. It was a ruthless enemy, waging its own war against his vision. Every luxury item, every detail that was meant to transform Boscobel from a simple house into a work of art, began its journey with unimaginable risk. Imagine a fragile pane of glass cast by the best craftsmen in Europe. It is carefully packed in straw and wooden crates, loaded onto a sailing ship that for weeks, or even months, will be tossed about by the merciless elements. Every storm, every giant wave, is a potential death sentence for the cargo, which is worth a fortune. It was a logistical battle of epic proportions. Every stone for that wall was paid for not only with money, but with time, risk, and human labor. The ship could be becalmed and drift for weeks. It could be captured by pirates. It could simply sink to the bottom, taking with it not only the lives of the sailors, but Dyckman's dream of a perfect window or an ideal cornice. But even if the ship arrived safely in the port of New York, the trials were only just beginning. Now this precious cargo, the finest porcelain, rolls of expensive fabrics, crates of fragile glass, had to be transported upstate. The roads of the early 19th century were not paved highways. They were muddy, rutted tracks that turned into impassable swamps after a rain. The cargo was transferred from ships to river barges, and then to ox-drawn carts. And so, at a walking pace, these caravans of luxury began their slow, arduous journey. Every pothole in the road was a threat. Every creak of the wheel echoed in Dyckman's heart, even thousands of miles away. Every broken pane of glass, every cracked plate, was not just a financial loss. It was a blow to his perfectionism. It was a hole in his ideal picture of the world, one that would take months to patch by sending new orders and starting up this infernal flywheel of transatlantic logistics all over again. The project, already stretching his financial resources to the limit, was constantly under attack from this invisible enemy: distance. Delays in shipments meant idle workers. Lost cargo meant unforeseen expenses. The construction of Boscobel was not simply an act of creation. It was a constant struggle against geography, against the weather, against the very nature of things. Dyckman wanted to build an oasis of European refinement on the wild American shore. But every element of that refinement had to be literally dragged through the mud and chaos of the New World. And this battle with distance exhausted him no less than the fight with his creditors or his own illness. He was winning it, but he was paying for the victory with time, and the time he had left was growing ever shorter. We know the name of the man who conceived this house. His letters, his bills, his ambitions, all have been preserved in the archives. But who actually turned his dream into reality? Who drove the nails, shaped the stones, and raised the rafters under the scorching summer sun? History, as always, prefers to speak of the patrons, not the builders. But Boscobel wasn't built with ink on paper. It was built with calloused hands. They were the unsung heroes of this saga, local carpenters, whose families had lived in this valley for generations. Masons, whose names survive only in parish registers. Perhaps immigrant laborers, Irish or German, seeking any opportunity in the New World to earn their daily bread. Their voices were not preserved in letters. Their thoughts were not recorded in diaries. But their work speaks for itself. It is captured in the perfectly fitted boards, in the smoothness of the walls, in the strength of the foundation. Every day they came to this construction site, bringing with them only their tools and their craftsmanship. They didn't read English architectural catalogs or visit London mansions, but it was they who had to bring to life a stranger's fantasy, sent from across the ocean. They looked at the blueprints of William Yeomans and tried to understand how to turn these lines on paper into something tangible. Their work was the pinnacle of craftsmanship. This is especially evident in the heart of the house, its staircase. It doesn't just connect the floors. It floats. It seems to hang in midair, light and graceful, defying the laws of gravity. There are no massive supports, no visible pillars. It is a marvel of engineering and a testament to the carpentry genius of the early 19th century. Every curve of the railing, every step, was carved and fitted by hand with a precision that seems impossible today without computer modeling. Creating this staircase wasn't just a job, it was a dialogue between wood and man. The craftsman had to feel the material, understand its tension, its potential. He was solving a puzzle posed by an unseen patron from London, and he solved it. These men who built Boscobel did not share Dyckman's ambitions. For them, it was just a job, perhaps the most difficult and best-paying job in the area. They were building a palace for a man they considered an outsider, but in the process, they were creating something more than just a house. They poured their skill, their time, a piece of their lives into it. And herein lies one of the greatest ironies of this story. The house, conceived as a monument to one man, his taste and his wealth, actually became a monument to them, to the nameless craftsman whose hands created a beauty that outlived Dyckman himself, his dynasty, and all his vain dreams. They were building another man's house, but in truth, they were building their own legacy, a legacy in stone and wood that we can still see today. As the walls of Boscobel rose higher and higher, something else was growing inside its creator, invisible, merciless, consuming him from within. In his letters, which still cross the ocean, states Morris Dyckman wrote ever more frequently, not of cornices and wallpaper. He wrote of weakness, of fever, of a cough that tore his chest apart. The diagnosis in those days was a death sentence: tuberculosis, consumption, a disease that slowly devoured the lungs, leaving no hope. And in that moment, everything changes. The construction is no longer a project. It becomes a race, a desperate, frantic race against death. Dyckman is no longer just a perfectionist architect. He is a man who sees the finish line of his life and is desperately trying to make it in time. His letters from London become feverish, almost hysterical. He rushes the builders. He demands that deliveries be expedited. He spends his last pennies, no longer thinking of the future, because he feels he might not have one. Every hammer blow on the construction site in New York echoes in his ailing chest. Every new day he greets is another day he has won from the disease to see his vision through to the end. Each stone laid in the wall is no longer a stock bought on the verge of bankruptcy. It is a second of life, turned into eternity. He is no longer building a house where he plans to live, host receptions, and enjoy the views of the Hudson. He understands this. He is building his own mausoleum, a monument that must remain after he is gone, the only thing he can pit against oblivion. This elegant, harmonious structure, meant to symbolize order and reason, is now being born in an atmosphere of panic and despair. Dyckman, a man who had meticulously calculated everything his entire life, from currency exchange rates to the shade of paint, now throws everything he has onto the altar of his creation, the remnants of his health, the remnants of his fortune, the remnants of his time. Boscobel becomes his final gamble in a game with fate. He has already lost the war for his reputation among his neighbors. He is losing the war with his own body. But he believes he can win the war against oblivion. If he can finish this house in time, he will not disappear without a trace. His name will be carved not on a tombstone, but on the facade of this masterpiece. The construction site turns into a battlefield. On one side, the will of a single man. On the other, the relentless march of time, measured not by clocks, but by the wheezing in his chest. He pours all his life force into this house, literally breathing it into the blueprints and letters. He doesn't yet know who will win this race, but he feels the cold breath of his opponent on the back of his neck, and so he runs with his last ounce of strength. August 1806. A thick, humid heat hangs over the Hudson Valley. On the Boscobel construction site, work is in full swing. Carpenters are finishing the interior trim. Painters are applying the final coats of paint. The house is almost ready. It is already breathing. It is already making a statement, its perfect proportions reflected in the slow waters of the river. Only the final touches remain, the last nails. But the man who would have heard the sound of each of those nails like a beat of his own heart hears nothing anymore. Thousands of miles away, far from his creation, states Morris Dyckman is losing his race. Death was faster. He dies, never having set foot on the porch of his house, without spending a single night within its walls, without seeing the setting sun flood the drawing room he had so meticulously designed with light. The dream collapsed, one step from the finish line. The moment the news of his death crossed the ocean and reached the construction site, everything stopped. The hammering stopped. The sawing fell silent. A sudden, deafening silence descended upon the unfinished masterpiece. It wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a catastrophe. The workers, who had poured months of their labor into this house, were left unpaid. The suppliers, who had delivered expensive materials on good faith, were left with unpaid bills. The grand vision that had driven this complex mechanism forward had run dry. The house, intended as a monument, suddenly became an orphan. It stood, nearly complete, but now needed by no one. A beautiful but useless shell, deprived of its creator's soul. Its windows, which were meant to look out on the river, now seemed like empty eye sockets. Its grand entrance, designed to welcome hundreds of guests, remained locked. The entire irony of Dyckman's life was concentrated in this moment. The man who so desperately wanted to write his name into history with stone had succeeded, but not in the way he wanted. He did not become the master of a legendary estate. He became its first victim. His final legacy was not a completed triumph, but a huge, magnificent question hanging in the air. What would happen now to this house? What would become of the dream that had been paid for with a life? The final nail was never driven. Instead, the first nail was driven into the coffin of the project. And now the future of this grandiose building, this architectural last will and testament, hung by the thinnest of threads. When mourning clothes gave way to blueprints, and the sounds of weeping were replaced by the sound of hammers, a new figure entered the scene, Elizabeth Dyckman, the widow. Until that moment, she had been merely a shadow of her ambitious husband, a woman from a good family of patriots whose name lent respectability to his questionable fortune. Now she found herself at the very center of the ruins of his dream. It wasn't just an unfinished house that fell upon her shoulders. It was the full weight of his obsession. She was left alone, with a young son in her arms, with a magnificent, nearly finished mansion that had already begun to devour itself, and with an army of creditors who were no longer willing to wait. The bills her husband had so recklessly signed in his pursuit of perfection now demanded payment. In an instant, the great architectural dream had turned into a heavy financial burden. Every elegant column, every roll of expensive wallpaper, every pane of imported glass, all of it was no longer a symbol of status, but an entry in a ledger of debt. Elizabeth found herself the mistress not of a palace, but of the most expensive unfinished home in the Hudson Valley. She had to make decisions her perfectionist husband would never have dared to make. She was forced to become not a dreamer, but a crisis manager. She began selling off the land. The very acres that were meant to become a picturesque park surrounding her home were auctioned off to pay the masons and carpenters. Every plot of land sold was another step back from the grand design, another concession to harsh reality. She reviewed his plans, his feverish letters from London, and ruthlessly crossed out everything that wasn't absolutely essential. Expensive decorative elements he had ordered but had not yet been delivered were canceled. Exquisite interior details that existed only on paper were never realized. The house, conceived as an uncompromising masterpiece, was now being completed under a regime of strictest austerity. It was a quiet, invisible war of a woman against the legacy of a man's vanity. She wasn't fighting for glory. She was fighting for a roof over her son's head. She wasn't trying to create a monument. She was trying to save her family from complete bankruptcy. Her courage wasn't in dreaming, but in waking up and coming face to face with the nightmare that dream left behind. Elizabeth Dyckman, the widow of a Loyalist, the daughter of a patriot, managed to do what her husband could not. She finished Boscobel, but the price of its completion was the abandonment of the very essence of his vision. She saved the house, but she killed the dream. And now, she and her son would have to live within the walls of this hard-won, compromised triumph. By 1808, the last worker had left Boscobel. The house was finally finished, but the air did not ring with triumph. Instead of champagne and music, its halls were filled with a hollow, all-pervading silence. Elizabeth and her young son, Peter, entered their new home. But it wasn't a home. It was a vast, cold stage set. Everything here was designed for another life, for a life that would never be. The wide central hall, designed to accommodate dozens of guests, greeted only two lonely people. The spacious dining room, intended for lavish dinner parties, saw only the modest meals of a mother and son. Every object in this house screamed of its creator's ambitions. The English furniture, bought for a fortune, stood like a museum exhibit, awaiting admiring glances that never came. The expensive silk curtains, meant to frame a view of the bustling river, instead bore witness to quiet, solitary evenings. The house, intended as a stage to display status and wealth, had become a silent mausoleum. Instead of balls and routs, mourning and strict economy, instead of loud laughter and political debates, whispers and the creaking of floorboards, Boscobel was a machine for high society, left to run idle. Elizabeth could not and would not live the life her husband had dreamed of. She was surrounded by neighbors who still saw her as the wife of an enemy collaborator. Her financial situation, despite all her efforts, remained precarious. Hosting receptions would have been not only inappropriate, but ruinous. And so, the magnificent mansion became a gilded cage. It was too large, too expensive to maintain, too filled with the ghosts of unfulfilled hopes. It demanded a life its inhabitants could not give it. It was built to make a statement, but now it was condemned to silence. The grand halls, which were meant to be the heart of Hudson Valley society, became a monument to failure. The house that had been the answer to all of Dyckman's questions now posed one crucial question to its new residents: how to live on in the shadow of such a grand and empty dream. Silence was the only answer, and that silence was deafening. Years passed. The silence in Boscobel's grand halls grew deeper, more familiar. Elizabeth Dyckman lived out her days within the walls of this grand monument to a man's vanity. All her hope, the entire meaning of her sacrifices, was now focused on one person: her son, Peter Corn Dyckman. He was the sole heir, the one for whom all this was done. He grew up in this enormous, half-empty house in the shadow of his father's great but unfulfilled ambitions. Boscobel was meant to be his ancestral home, a launching pad for a brilliant career, a symbol of the dynasty his father had intended to found. He was the future for which so many sacrifices had been made. But fate, or perhaps the curse of this house, had not yet dealt its final, most cruel blow. In 1824, just 1 year after his mother's death, Peter Dyckman died. He was only 21 years old. 21. He passed away without ever marrying, without leaving an heir. In an instant, with the death of this young man, the direct Dyckman line was broken. The dynasty for which this palace was built had ended almost as soon as it began. It was the final, crushing failure. Everything had been in vain. The questionable fortune amassed during the war, the years of struggle with the British crown, the desperate race against death, the widow's sacrifices, all of it. For what? For a house that no longer had a master. In an instant, the house's monument lost all meaning. It had been conceived as an ark to preserve a name and a legacy. But now, there was no one left to save. It became just a building, an expensive, beautiful, but utterly meaningless pile of stone, wood, and debt. The ambitious project, which had cost a fortune, a reputation, and ultimately a life, ended in complete ruin. The final act of this drama was an auction. Boscobel, the dream and curse of the Dyckman family, was put up for sale to cover the remaining debts. The auctioneer's gavel, striking the block, sounded like an epitaph. It didn't just put an end to one family's story. It announced the death of the original vision. The house had outlived its creator. It had outlived his only heir. Now it was destined to live its own, unpredictable life, completely detached from those for whom it was built. Dyckman's great dream was dead, but the story of the house itself was just beginning. After the auctioneer's gavel brought the story of the Dyckman family to a close, Boscobel began a life of its own, a life without purpose, without a grand design. It simply became a house. Over the next 120 years, it passed from hand to hand, like a jewel that new owners didn't always know how to wear. At first, it was owned by wealthy families who appreciated its elegance. But with each new owner, the house lost a piece of its soul. The original furniture that States Dyckman had so obsessively ordered from London was gradually sold off, replaced by more fashionable and then simply cheaper pieces. The expensive fabrics faded and frayed. The delicate porcelain was broken and disappeared. Slowly, but surely, the house lost its original luster, like an aristocrat forced to sell off the family silver. By the early 20th century, not a trace of its former grandeur remained. Boscobel had become an ordinary farmhouse. Its grand halls, designed for balls, were now perhaps used to store crops. Its elegant bedrooms, where gentlemen and ladies were meant to rest, became the dwelling of simple tenant farmers. Dyckman's grand design was buried under layers of the mundane. Archival photographs from that era show us this slow decline. The house looks tired. It seems too large, too ornate for the modest life that flickered within its walls. It was like a gilded cage from which the bird had long since flown. For some owners, it was just an old, inconvenient house. For others, an unbearable burden, demanding constant repairs and expense. Its true value, its unique architectural purity, was all but forgotten. It became just a local landmark, an old mansion on a hill, the subject of vague legends. No one remembered the London catalogues anymore, the battle against distance, the race against death. The house was silent about its dramatic birth. It simply grew old. For more than a century, Boscobel witnessed the changing of eras. It saw the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, the birth of the automobile. The world around it changed beyond recognition. But it remained, only growing more dilapidated and sinking into oblivion. Its story, it seemed, had reached its logical, quiet, and inglorious end. It had fulfilled its function. It had outlived its creator. But now, it seemed, its own time had run out. 1954. America at the peak of its power. The country is hurtling toward the future, obsessed with speed, progress, and new technologies. The nation is building giant highways, which, like arteries, were meant to connect its growing cities. In this new reality, the past is merely an inconvenient obstacle. And Boscobel had become just such an obstacle. The dilapidated, abandoned mansion stood directly in the path of a planned highway. For the engineers of Westchester County, it was a simple problem with an obvious solution. An old house. It needed to be demolished. The house, which had survived wars, economic depressions, and a dozen different owners, was sentenced to death with the stroke of a pen on a land use plan. But just as the bulldozers were warming up their engines, something unexpected happened. The house found its defenders. A small group of local enthusiasts, amateur historians, people who could see the ghost of former grandeur behind the peeling paint and broken windows. They called themselves the Friends of Boscobel, and they entered into an unequal battle with the bulldozer of progress. They wrote letters, knocked on officials' doors, and tried to raise money. But their voices were drowned out by the noise of the new era. The authorities were adamant. A society, intoxicated by the future, saw no value in the ruins of the past. The rescue campaign failed. And then came the final act of humiliation. The house, which had once been worth a fortune, was officially sold. Sold for scrap. Its final price, recorded in the documents, became an epitaph for Dyckman's entire vision. $35. This wasn't payment for the land, or for the architecture. It was the fee for the right to destroy, to turn a masterpiece into a pile of rubble. The tension mounted with each passing day. The deadline for demolition was running out. It seemed it was all over. The building's story, which began with financial fraud and architectural obsession, was about to end ingloriously under the tracks of an excavator. This was the point of no return, the moment when the past was supposed to give way to the future, leaving nothing behind but dust. But the story of Boscobel is a story of paradoxes, and its greatest paradox was yet to come. It was at this very moment, in its darkest hour, when all hope was lost, that a miracle occurred. And this miracle came not from the government, not from a historical society, but from the very heart of American capitalism, the same force that had seemingly handed the house its death sentence. At the very last moment, when the clank of the bulldozer tracks already sounded like a death knell, the phone rang. On the other end of the line was a voice that offered to buy the house, not for $35, but for any price. The savior wished to remain anonymous. Only years later would her name be revealed. Lila Atchison Wallace, co-founder of Reader's Digest, an empire built on millions of copies and a belief in simple American values. And once again, just as it had a century and a half earlier, new money came to the aid of the old house. 20th century capital, earned from mass culture, saved a masterpiece born from 18th century capital, earned from military corruption. An operation began, unprecedented in its audacity and scale. Boscobel couldn't be left in its place, but it could be moved. They decided to literally dismantle the landmark house, piece by piece, like a child's construction set. This wasn't a restoration, it was a surgical intervention. A team of the best architects and carpenters, like surgeons, began to carefully dissect the old building. Every board, every brick, every piece of carved decor was carefully removed, labeled, and catalogued. Over 6,000 numbered pieces, hundreds of tons of history that had to be transported and reassembled. The dismantled house was stored for several years in barns and warehouses across the region, like a sleeping army, waiting for its moment. Then, the search began for a new home for the house. Lila Wallace personally chose the location, 15 miles up the river in the town of Garrison, a spot that offered that very same, now iconic view of the Hudson River and the West Point Academy. And so, in its new location, a triumphant revival began. Fragment by fragment, detail by detail, Boscobel was put back together. It was a resurrection from the dead. And when it opened its doors again in 1961, it was no longer just a house. It was a symbol that beauty can outlive its creator. That architectural perfection ultimately proves more important than the questionable ambitions that gave birth to it. The house survived, not because of State's Morris Dyckman, but in spite of him. It was saved not by its origin, but by its form, not by its history, but by its geometry. And here is the final, grand irony. A house built by a loyalist with British money to buy his place in the new America was saved by a 20th century philanthropist to become a national treasure. Today, it stands in its new location, gazing upon the citadel of American patriotism, and its silence is more eloquent than any words. It outlived its creator. It outlived his family. It outlived its own death and oblivion. State's Morris Dyckman wanted to build a monument to himself. He had no idea he was building something more. He built a legend that turned out to be far more interesting and enduring than his own life. He achieved eternity, but not the one he had dreamed of. The story of Boscobel is not the story of a man, but the story of stone that proved more honest and enduring than its creator. It's a paradox of how the most questionable ambitions can give birth to the purest beauty, and how a legacy built on lies can eventually find its own independent truth. Where is the line at which beauty redeems the sins of its creator? And can we, knowing the full truth about the questionable foundation upon which a masterpiece stands, still see in it nothing but pure perfection? This debate is eternal, and it has no right answer. But we would be interested to hear your opinion. Share it in the comments, because it is from dialogues like these that a genuine understanding of history is born. And of course, if this story made you think, the best way to thank us would be to subscribe and leave a like.